The year was 1871, when the Nebraska Territory stood as an unforgiving challenge to those seeking a fresh start. In these vast grasslands where summer's scorching heat gave way to winter's merciless grasp, survival measured one's worth more clearly than any coin. Here courage meant endurance, and kindness was as precious as water in drought. This is the extraordinary tale of Margaret Mitchell, a widow with 5 daughters whose strength would be tested beyond measure, and Standing Bear, a Lakota father whose wisdom transcended the bitter boundaries between their worlds. Abandoned and facing certain death as the harshest winter in decades approached, Margaret's journey would become a testament to human resilience and the profound connections that can form when all hope seems lost. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. October 1871 descended upon the Nebraska plains with warning signs that only the most experienced settlers recognized. Birds migrated earlier than usual, beavers built higher dams, and prairie wolves ventured closer to settlements than they typically dared. Nature was preparing for something severe, something those with generations of knowledge respected with solemn preparation. In the small settlement of Willow Creek, the residents busied themselves with final harvests and winterizing cabins. Their conversations increasingly focused on weather predictions and supply calculations, all except for one household that sat at the eastern edge of town, a modest log cabin with a sagging porch and thin wisps of smoke rising from its stone chimney. Margaret Mitchell stood at her doorway, watching her 2 youngest daughters attempt to gather kindling from the increasingly sparse area around their cabin. At 32, her face retained the gentle beauty that had once turned heads back in Ohio, though grief and hardship had etched permanent lines around her eyes and mouth. Her brown hair, streaked prematurely with gray, was pulled back in a practical bun, and her blue eyes carried the weariness of someone fighting an impossible battle. 8 months had passed since influenza had claimed her husband Thomas, leaving her alone with 5 daughters in a community that had initially welcomed them for Thomas's blacksmithing skills, but now viewed them with a mixture of pity and inconvenience. 8 months of dwindling resources, of selling precious possessions, for basic necessities, of learning that sympathy had definite limits when it came to practical assistance. "Mama, look what we found!" 7-year-old Clara held up a handful of twigs with the pride of someone offering treasure. Beside her, 5-year-old Abigail nodded enthusiastically, clutching her own meager collection. "That's wonderful, my love," Margaret replied, forcing brightness into her voice. "Bring them inside, and we'll add them to our stack." The stack, a pathetically small pile of wood by the hearth, wouldn't last more than a few days once a true cold set in. Margaret's gaze drifted to the horizon where dark clouds gathered, bringing the promise of the season's first significant snow. The pantry held barely enough flour for a week of bread, some dried beans, and 3 precious jars of preserves her daughters had helped her make from late summer berries. Not enough, not nearly enough. Inside the cabin's single room, her 3 older daughters were engaged in their daily tasks. Elizabeth, at 15, was the eldest, already showing the determination and quiet strength that had kept the family functioning since Thomas's death. She sat mending one of Abigail's dresses, her needle flashing in the dim light from the cabin's single window. 13-year-old Sarah kneaded dough for the evening bread, her movements efficient despite her youth. And 10-year-old Rebecca sorted through the family's winter clothing, taking inventory of what could be patched, what could be handed down, and what was beyond salvaging. "The Petersons' wagon left this morning," Elizabeth said, without looking up from her sewing. "Mrs. Peterson said they're heading to her sister's place in Kansas before the roads become impassable." Margaret nodded, unsurprised. 3 families had departed Willow Creek in the past week alone. those with connections elsewhere choosing to seek winter sanctuary rather than risk the coming months in a settlement barely 3 years old. Did she say anything else? Margaret asked, knowing her eldest daughter often gathered community news while collecting water from the town well. Elizabeth's hands stilled momentarily. Just that Mayor Wilson wants to speak with you. She said he'd be coming by this afternoon. A knot formed in Margaret's stomach. Mayor Samuel Wilson had been increasingly direct about her situation since Thomas's passing. His solutions inevitably involved separating the family, sending the older girls to work as domestic help in more established households, perhaps finding Margaret herself a position as housekeeper for one of the town's widowers. Practical solutions that ignored the heart of what made life worth living, her daughters together under one roof. A sharp knock interrupted her thoughts, earlier than expected. Margaret smoothed her apron and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "Girls, continue with your work," she instructed quietly before opening the door. Mayor Wilson stood on her threshold, his substantial frame blocking the afternoon light. At 55, he carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to having his opinions respected, his thinning hair combed carefully over his balding pate and his beard neatly trimmed. "Mrs. Mitchell," he acknowledged with a curt nod. "May I have a word?" "Of course, Mayor Wilson." Margaret stepped aside. "Please come in." The mayor entered but remained standing near the door, his gaze sweeping the cabin's interior and lingering on the meager woodpile and the 5 girls who had paused in their activities to watch this exchange. "I'll be direct, Mrs. Mitchell," he began, removing his hat but keeping his coat buttoned. "The town council met last night regarding your circumstances." Margaret straightened her spine, aware of Elizabeth's protective gaze from across the room. "And what did the council determine about my private matters this time?" she asked, unable to keep a slight edge from her voice. Wilson's expression hardened. "Now, Margaret, there's no need for that tone. We are concerned citizens looking out for the welfare of one of our own. The fact is, you cannot sustain this household through winter. Your late husband's position has been filled by the new blacksmith, and your sewing work isn't sufficient to feed 6 mouths during the coming months." He gestured vaguely toward the cabin's sparse provisions. "The Jenkins family is departing for Fort Kearney tomorrow morning. They've agreed to take your 3 eldest girls with them. Mrs. Jenkins has connections at the fort. The girls could find positions in officers' households. Good, respectable work with reliable meals. And separate them from their family?" Margaret asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Wilson continued as if she hadn't spoken. "The widow Simmons has agreed to take you and the 2 youngest as boarders through winter in exchange for your assistance with her laundry business. By spring, we can reassess the situation." Margaret felt a cold rage building in her chest. The kind of anger that came from months of barely contained fear finally finding focus. "You propose to divide my family, to send my daughters, children still, to work as servants among strangers. I propose to ensure they survive the winter," Wilson countered, his tone sharpening. "The Weather Service has predicted exceptional severity in the coming months. This settlement has limited resources. Those who cannot provide for themselves must accept help on the terms available." "My husband helped build this settlement," Margaret replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. "He shod your horses, repaired your tools, worked from dawn until dusk to establish this community." "And we all grieved Thomas's passing," Wilson said, softening his tone slightly. "But sentiment doesn't fill stomachs, Margaret. This is the frontier. Practical solutions are what matter now." Before Margaret could respond, Elizabeth stepped forward, her young face set in determined lines. "We can manage, Mayor Wilson. I've been helping Mrs. Bradford with her newborn twins. She pays me in flour and potatoes. Sarah has been assisting at the mercantile on Saturdays and—" "Child's efforts," Wilson interrupted dismissively. "Admirable, but insufficient. The council has made its recommendation. The Jenkins leave at first light. They're doing your family a considerable kindness by taking on 3 extra travelers. And if we decline this kindness? Margaret asked, placing a protective hand on Elizabeth's shoulder. Wilson's face reddened. Then I cannot be responsible for what happens. Your supplies won't last 2 weeks of true winter. We've all got our own families to consider, Mrs. Mitchell. Charity has its limits, especially when reasonable alternatives are rejected. There it was, the threat wrapped in concern. Accept dismantling her family or face starvation alone. I need time to consider, Margaret said, fighting to keep her voice steady. The Jenkins depart at dawn, Wilson replied, already turning toward the door. Pack light for the girls. Space in their wagon is limited, and they're doing you an immense favor. After he left, silence filled the cabin, broken only by little Abigail's confused whisper. Mama, are Lizzie and Sarah and Becca going away? Margaret gathered her youngest daughter into her arms, meeting the eyes of her 3 eldest girls over Abigail's head. The fear she saw there mirrored her own, but she also recognized something else. The stubborn Mitchell determination that Thomas had always claimed would see them through anything. No one is going anywhere, she said firmly, making a decision she prayed she wouldn't regret. We are a family. We stay together. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. The wind had picked up, whistling through the cabin's imperfect seals and bringing the first flurries of snow. Her decision to decline Wilson's solution weighed heavily as she mentally inventoried their supplies yet again, searching for some strategy she'd overlooked. By morning, snow covered the ground in a thin, white blanket, and the Jenkins wagon rolled past their cabin without stopping. Margaret watched through frosted windows, feeling both relief and terror. Relief that her family remained intact, terror at the responsibility of keeping them all alive through what was coming. 3 days later, their situation had grown dire. The temperature plummeted, and the initial snowfall had been followed by a second heavier storm that left 18 inches of accumulation. Their woodpile had dwindled alarmingly, and Margaret had begun breaking up a chair for fuel, promising her wide-eyed daughters that spring would bring materials for new furniture. On the 4th morning, she woke to find the water bucket frozen, solid. The fire had died in the night, and her breath formed clouds in the frigid air of the cabin. The girls huddled together under every blanket they owned. 5 heads of varying shades of brown, nested together like birds. Margaret forced herself outside to gather the last of their firewood. The world beyond their door had transformed into something alien, beautiful in its crystalline perfection, but deadly in its intent. Snow had drifted against the north wall of the cabin, reaching nearly to the window. The path to town was completely obscured, though smoke rising from distant chimneys proved life continued there without them. As Margaret struggled to carry the last armload of wood inside, a figure appeared at the edge of their property. For a moment, hope flared that someone from town had come to check on their welfare. Then she recognized the imposing silhouette of Frederick Harmon, the mercantile owner who had extended credit to her after Thomas's death. Credit that had run out weeks ago. Mrs. Mitchell, Harmon called, trudging through the deep snow toward her. Didn't expect to find you still here. Thought you'd sent the girls with the Jenkins. Margaret clutched the wood tighter. We declined the offer, Mr. Harmon. Harmon's weathered face registered surprise, then something closer to judgment. That wasn't wise, ma'am. Not wise at all. He glanced at her dwindling woodpile. I came to check if there might be anything of value left in the cabin. Mayor Wilson mentioned you'd likely accepted his arrangement, and there's the matter of your outstanding debt at my store. The boldness of his assumption that she would simply surrender, that her home and belongings would be forfeit, struck Margaret like a physical blow. This is my property, Mr. Harmon. I've not abandoned anything. Harmon's expression hardened. Property requires payment of taxes, Mrs. Mitchell. Taxes I doubt you can afford. I will settle my debt, Margaret interrupted, summoning dignity despite her desperate circumstances, but not by surrendering my home to scavengers. A dangerous look crossed Harmon's face. Careful with your words, Mrs. Mitchell. You've no protector now, and winter's just begun. Pride makes for cold comfort when the blizzards come. With that thinly veiled threat, he turned and trudged back toward town, leaving Margaret shaking. Partly from cold, partly from fury, and partly from the terrible knowledge that he was right. She had food for perhaps another week, firewood for 2 days if she was careful, and no prospects for obtaining more of either. That night, as temperatures plunged to new depths and wind rattled her windows with increasing ferocity, Margaret faced the truth she had been avoiding. They would not survive this winter alone. The town had made its decision about their value, and that decision amounted to abandonment. In the darkest hours before dawn, with her daughters sleeping fitfully nearby, Margaret made a desperate plan. They would attempt to reach Fort Kearney, some 20 miles to the southeast. It was a perilous journey in good weather, potentially fatal in these conditions, but remaining meant certain death by starvation or freezing. By first light, she had packed everything they could carry: their remaining food, Thomas's hunting knife, matches wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, extra socks and gloves, and his compass. She dressed the girls in layers, wrapping scarves around their faces and making sure each had the warmest mittens available. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Mama, where are we going?" Rebecca asked, eyes wide, with a mixture of fear and trust that nearly broke Margaret's heart. "We are going to find help," Margaret answered, projecting a confidence she didn't feel. "We'll follow the old mail road to Fort Kearney. There are people there who can help us through winter. Is it far?" Sarah asked, helping little Abigail with her boots. Margaret hesitated, then chose honesty. "Yes, it's far. We'll need to be brave and strong, all of us together." Elizabeth, always perceptive, met her mother's eyes with understanding beyond her years. "It's this or freeze here, isn't it?" Margaret nodded, unable to shield her eldest from the harsh reality. "Yes, but we are Mitchells. Your father always said that Mitchells find a way, and that's exactly what we're going to do." As they stepped out into the bitter morning, Margaret felt a strange sense of finality wash over her. They might never see this cabin again, the home where Thomas had laughed and loved and taught his daughters to identify constellations through the small window, where baby Abigail had taken her first steps, where they had celebrated birthdays with simple gifts but abundant affection. Tears threatened to freeze on her cheeks as she whispered a goodbye to the life they had built and the dreams now buried with Thomas. Then, gathering her strength and her children, Margaret Mitchell turned toward the southeast and began the journey that would either save her family or claim them all. The journey began promisingly enough. Though the snow was deep, the morning sky was clear, and Margaret used Thomas's compass to orient them southeast toward Fort Kearney. She placed Elizabeth in charge of 10-year-old Rebecca and 7-year-old Clara, while she carried 5-year-old Abigail and kept 13-year-old Sarah close by her side. They moved in single file, taking turns breaking trail through snow that sometimes reached the older girl's knees. For the first few hours, determination drove them forward. Margaret pictured Fort Kearney with its garrison of soldiers, sturdy buildings, and established community. She imagined finding work as a seamstress or cook, perhaps securing a small room where her girls could sleep safely while they rebuilt their lives. Anywhere would be better than slowly freezing in an abandoned cabin. "Tell us a story, Mama," Clara requested as they paused for a brief rest, her small face pinched with cold despite the scarf wrapped around it. Margaret rummaged in her pack and distributed small pieces of cornbread, their meager midday meal. "What kind of story would you like?" "The one about when you and Papa first came west," Sarah suggested, "about the wagon train and the buffalo herd." Margaret smiled sadly, grateful for the distraction. As they continued walking, she recounted the journey that had brought them to Nebraska territory 3 years earlier, when Thomas had been full of dreams about building a new life where his blacksmithing skills would be valued and land was affordable, enough for a man of modest means. By early afternoon, clouds began gathering on the western horizon, dark and ominous. The wind picked up, carrying the first biting flakes of a new storm. Margaret quickened their pace, though fatigue had already begun to set in. Her arms ached from carrying Abigail, who had tried walking but couldn't manage the deep snow for long. "How much farther, Mama?" Rebecca asked, her breath forming clouds in the increasingly bitter air. "Several miles yet," Margaret answered honestly. "We need to keep moving." Elizabeth, ever practical, suggested they take turns carrying Abigail. "We'll go faster if we share the weight." By mid-afternoon, the storm had engulfed them completely. Visibility reduced to mere feet in front of them, and the howling wind disoriented their sense of direction. Even with the compass, maintaining a straight course became nearly impossible, as they were forced to detour around deep drifts and unseen obstacles beneath the snow. "Keep moving," Margaret urged, Thomas's voice seeming to echo in her mind. To stop is to die. But as the short winter day began to fade, Margaret realized with growing horror that they were lost. The landmarks she had tried to memorize from Thomas's old maps were obscured by the blizzard. Worse, her strength was failing. Rapidly, each step required more effort than the last, and a dangerous warmth began to spread through her limbs, despite the plummeting temperature, the first warning sign of hypothermia that Thomas had once described. The girls were struggling too. Abigail had fallen into an exhausted sleep in Sarah's arms. Clara was stumbling every few steps, and even stoic Elizabeth's face showed signs of dangerous fatigue. As darkness fell in earnest, they stumbled upon a small copse of trees, barely more than a dozen cottonwoods clustered together, but offering minimal shelter from the driving snow. With the last of her strength, Margaret led her daughters beneath the lowest branches of the largest tree, huddling against its trunk and wrapping their blankets around all 6 of them. "Just until the storm passes," she whispered, knowing even as the words left her lips that she was lying to herself. The storm showed no signs of abating, and even if it did, she had no clear idea of which direction to travel come morning. The cold penetrated their layers of clothing, and the blankets that had seemed so substantial now felt paper-thin. Margaret's thoughts turned to Thomas. Perhaps there was mercy in this end, a reunion with him beyond the veil of this life. Her eyelids grew heavy, the temptation to sleep nearly overwhelming. "Not yet," she murmured, forcing her eyes open. "Not like this." But nature cared nothing for human determination. The blizzard raged on, depositing snow around their improvised shelter, gradually encasing them in a tomb of white. Margaret's consciousness began to fade, her mind drifting into memories of warmer days, of Thomas teaching Elizabeth how to shoe a horse, of summer picnics by Willow Creek, of baby Abigail taking her first steps across their cabin floor. Just as her eyes closed for what she believed would be the final time, a sound penetrated the howling wind, not the cry of wolves that she had feared might find them, but something rhythmic and deliberate. Footsteps approaching through the storm. Margaret forced her eyes open, straining to see through the curtain of snow. A dark silhouette materialized, then another and other, figures moving with a confidence that defied the blizzard's fury. For a moment, her heart leapt with irrational hope. Thomas somehow returned to her, before reality reasserted itself. The figures paused, seemingly scanning the area, then moved with sudden purpose toward their hiding place. Margaret shrank back against the tree trunk, instinctively gathering her daughters closer. The dangers of the prairie extended beyond cold and starvation. Thomas had warned her of desperate men who roamed these territories, outlaws and renegades to whom a widow and 5 girls would be merely another resource to exploit. She fumbled for Thomas's hunting knife, with fingers numb from cold, positioning herself in front of her children as best she could. The branches parted, and Margaret raised the knife with a hand that trembled from both fear and cold. The figure froze, observing her defensive posture. Then a deep voice spoke, calm and measured despite the raging storm. "You are far from any settlement, woman." In the dim light filtering through the snow-laden branches, Margaret could make out the features of a Native American man, Lakota, she guessed, from the distinctive pattern on the winter clothing he wore. His face, partially protected by a fur-lined hood, showed strength, but also a gentleness that didn't match the savage descriptions from frontier newspapers. I lost our way," Margaret managed to say, her voice rough from cold and disuse. "My daughters and I were trying to reach Fort Kearney." The man regarded her silently for a moment, his expression unreadable. Behind him, she could now make out 2 more figures, a woman and what appeared to be a teenage boy. "Fort Kearney lies many miles southeast," the man said finally. "This path leads only to death in the snow." "I know that now," Margaret replied, unable to keep a hint of desperation from her voice. She still held the knife, though her grip had weakened as the reality of their situation reasserted itself. These strangers, whoever they were, represented her children's only chance at survival. The man seemed to assess their condition with a single glance. "You cannot stay here. The cold has already begun to claim the little ones." Margaret knew he spoke the truth. Clara and Abigail had grown dangerously still, and even Sarah's teeth had stopped chattering, a warning sign rather than improvement. "Can you stand?" the man asked, his tone neither unkind nor particularly compassionate, merely practical. Margaret nodded, though in truth she wasn't certain. As she attempted to rise, her legs buckled beneath her, numb from hours of immobility in the cold. Without comment, the stranger caught her arm, steadying her with surprising gentleness while the woman moved to help the children. "My winter camp lies to the west," he said. "Not far, but the journey will be difficult in your condition." He studied Margaret's face. "I am called Standing Bear among my people. The white traders who come to our lands know me as Bear." The woman, who had managed to rouse the children, spoke quietly to him in their native language. He nodded, then turned back to Margaret. "What is your name?" "Margaret," she replied, finding strange comfort in speaking it aloud after hours of silent desperation. "Margaret Mitchell. These are my daughters, Elizabeth, Sarah, Rebecca, Clara, and Abigail." Standing Bear nodded once. "My wife is Wichapi, star woman in your tongue. Our son is called Akacheta, meaning fighter." He surveyed the girls critically. "The little ones cannot walk. Wichapi and I will carry them. The others must walk. If they can, Akacheta will guide them." With that simple declaration, Margaret found herself entrusting her children's lives to people from a tribe she had been taught to fear. People whose very presence in these territories represented resistance to the westward expansion that had brought her family here. The irony was not lost on her, even in her weakened state. Standing Bear lifted little Abigail with gentle care, while Wichapi gathered Clara into her arms. Akacheta, a youth of perhaps 16, helped Sarah and Rebecca to their feet, speaking to them in broken English that nonetheless conveyed reassurance. Elizabeth, always the fastest to adapt, moved immediately to assist Margaret. They travelled in silence, save for occasional instructions from their rescuers. "Step here. Watch your footing. Rest a moment." Each delivered with the same economy of words that characterized everything about them. Margaret concentrated on placing one foot before the other, on remaining upright, on following the broad back of the youth who led her 3 oldest daughters, while Standing Bear and Wichapi carried the youngest. After what seemed like hours, but might have been less, the storm began to abate slightly, allowing brief glimpses of the terrain around them. They had entered a more densely wooded area, the trees providing some shelter from the wind and snow. In the distance, Margaret thought she glimpsed a faint glow. Firelight, perhaps. "We approach our winter camp," Standing Bear confirmed, noticing a change in attention. "The path grows steeper, take care." Indeed, they began to ascend a gentle slope, the going more difficult as Margaret's strength continued to wane. Twice she stumbled, and twice Elizabeth's strong young hands caught her before she could fall. The third time, her legs simply refused to support her anymore, buckling beneath her as darkness edged her vision. Without a word, Akacheta moved to her side, offering his shoulder for support. The youth, though slender, possessed surprising strength, taking much of her weight as they continued the ascent. "The lodge lies just ahead," Standing Bear reassured them, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Hold fast, Margaret Mitchell. Your spirit is stronger than this storm." As consciousness faded and her head came to rest against her daughter's shoulder, Margaret's last coherent thought was that perhaps death had indeed found her. But it had come in a form very different from what she had imagined, not the cold embrace of winter, but the unexpected kindness of strangers whose humanity defied the boundaries between their worlds. Margaret drifted through layers of consciousness, caught between the numbing embrace of winter and fleeting sensations of warmth. Her dreams were fragmented, Thomas calling her name, the girls laughing in summer sunshine, Mayor Wilson's cold dismissal, and through it all, the howling of a storm that seemed to have no end. When awareness finally returned, it came in stages. First, the crackling of fire, then the scent of something rich and unfamiliar cooking, and finally, the realization that she lay wrapped in soft furs rather than frozen beneath a cottonwood tree. She opened her eyes to find herself in a shelter unlike any she had seen before. Not quite a cabin, not exactly a tent, but something in between. A sturdy wooden framework covered in what appeared to be hides, the entire structure radiating a surprising warmth from the small fire pit at its center. The smoke rose to a hole in the roof, cleverly designed to draw it upward, without letting in the snow that she could still hear falling outside. "She wakes," a soft voice observed. Wichahpi, now visible in the firelight as she stirred something. In a clay pot suspended over the flames, her face no longer hidden by a hood, revealed a woman perhaps a few years older than Margaret, with intelligent eyes and strong features softened by a gentle expression. Margaret tried to sit up, instantly, anxious. "My daughter's sleep," Wichahpi assured her, gesturing to the far side of the lodge where 5 small forms lay bundled in furs, their breathing the steady rhythm of exhausted slumber. The little ones had ice in their boots, but no lasting harm. Relief washed over Margaret with such intensity that tears sprang to her eyes. Wichahpi moved to her side, offering a wooden cup filled with a steaming liquid. "Drink," she instructed, her English accented but clear. "Brings warmth back to the body." The cup warmed Margaret's hands pleasantly as she inhaled the unfamiliar aroma, some kind of broth with herbs she couldn't identify. When she sipped cautiously, the flavor surprised her, rich and earthy, with a slight bitterness that was not unpleasant. "Thank you," she murmured, taking another sip. "For this, and for—" She gestured vaguely, encompassing the shelter, the fire, her sleeping children, everything. Wichahpi nodded once in acknowledgement, returning to tend the pot over the fire. "Standing Bear and Akacheta hunt," she explained. "They will return soon." She studied Margaret with quiet assessment. "The winter shows no mercy to those unprepared. Why did you travel with little ones in such weather?" The question was direct, without judgment, simply seeking information. Margaret found herself explaining her situation, Thomas's death, the town's withdrawal of support, her desperate attempt to reach Fort Kearney before their supplies ran out completely. "Your people abandoned their own," Wichapi said when she finished, the statement carrying an undercurrent of something not quite anger, but perhaps disapproval. "They saw no value in keeping us," Margaret replied, unable to keep bitterness from her voice. "A widow with 5 daughters to feed has little purpose in their eyes." Wichapi seemed to consider this, her expression thoughtful as she stirred the pot. "The Lakota value children above all possessions. They are the future of the people." She added something to the mixture that released a fragrant steam. "No mother would be cast out, even among the poorest band." Her words, though simply stated, carried a weight that made Margaret's throat tighten with emotion. The validation of her worth, something Willow Creek had systematically stripped away, came unexpectedly from a woman whose people were portrayed as savages in every newspaper and dime novel that reached the frontier. Before Margaret could respond, the lodge's entrance flap moved aside, admitting a blast of cold air along with Standing Bear and Akacheta. They carried several rabbits, already field-dressed and ready for cooking. "The white woman wakes," Standing Bear observed, his dark eyes assessing Margaret's improved condition. "Good. The storm continues. 3 days now, the worst I have seen in many winters." "Will your supplies last?" Margaret asked, suddenly conscious that she and her daughters represented an additional burden on resources that had been meant for 3. A hint of amusement crossed Standing Bear's face. "I prepare well for winter moons. My people do not settle in one place during warm seasons. We follow the buffalo, gather plants, dry meat and berries. Winter camps are stocked to last until spring thaws." He handed the rabbits to Wichapi, who began preparing them with practiced efficiency. Akacheta moved to the fire, warming his hands while watching Margaret with undisguised curiosity. "Rest today," Standing Bear advised, removing his outer layers of fur. "Tomorrow, if you are stronger, we will speak of what comes next." Margaret nodded, still overwhelmed by the strangeness of her situation and the unexpected sanctuary they had found. "Why did you save us?" she asked suddenly. "You could have left us. Many would have." Standing Bear looked up from arranging his hunting gear, his dark eyes meeting hers directly across the fire. "Would you have left children to die in the snow if you had the means to help them?" "No," Margaret admitted, "but I'm not." She trailed off, uncertain how to express the thought without giving offense. "Not Lakota," he finished for her, his expression unchanged. "And I am not white. Yet the storm does not ask what color skin freezes beneath it. The wolf does not care what language is spoken by the flesh it hunts. We are all simply human before the winter." The profound simplicity of his worldview silenced her. Margaret finished her broth, feeling strength gradually returning to her limbs as the day progressed. She drifted in and out of sleep, her body demanding rest to recover from its ordeal. Each time she woke, her daughters remained peacefully asleep, their exhaustion clearly deeper than her own. Wichapi tended to them periodically, adjusting covers or gently feeling foreheads to check for fever. Standing Bear and Akacheta sat near the entrance, speaking quietly in their native language while repairing equipment and cleaning their hunting tools. By evening, when the girls finally began to stir, Margaret felt well enough to sit up properly, wrapped in the fur blanket they had provided. The storm continued unabated outside, its howling a constant reminder of the fate they had narrowly escaped. Abigail woke first, her small face confused and frightened until she spotted Margaret. "Mama!" she cried, scrambling across the lodge, to burrow into her mother's arms. One by one, the others woke, Clara with wide-eyed wonder at their surroundings, Rebecca with cautious assessment, Sarah with immediate questions about their rescuers, and Elizabeth with a solemn nod of understanding. toward Standing Bear that seemed to communicate volumes. As Wichapi prepared a substantial meal of rabbit stew with wild roots that tasted better than anything the Mitchells had eaten in months, Margaret observed the interaction between her daughters and their hosts with growing amazement. The initial fear she might have expected, particularly from her younger girls who had heard nothing but frightening stories about Indians, was absent, replaced by tentative curiosity. Clara, always the most outgoing, had positioned herself near Wichapi, watching the cooking process with fascination. Akacheta was showing Rebecca and Sarah how to repair a snowshoe, their initial wariness giving way to genuine interest in his explanations. And Elizabeth, ever practical, was studying the lodge's construction with the measured assessment of someone filing away valuable information for future reference. As they gathered to eat, Standing Bear spoke the first words that truly acknowledged the extraordinary nature of their situation. "Many winters have passed since white children sat at my fire," he said, his gaze moving from one Mitchell face to another. "You are welcome here until the storm ends and safe passage becomes possible." The storm persisted for 3 more days, confining the unlikely companions to the lodge and creating an unexpected space for connection. By the time the winds finally ceased their howling and sunshine cast long shadows across pristine snowdrifts, an unspoken transformation had begun within the shelter's hide walls. Standing Bear emerged from scouting the conditions around their camp, stamping snow from his moccasins as he ducked through the entrance. "The path remains blocked to Fort Kearney," he announced, addressing Margaret, who sat mending one of Abigail's mittens with sinew thread Wichapi had taught her to use. "Many weeks before safe travel becomes possible," Margaret nodded, surprised to find herself less anxious about this news than she might have expected. The days of recovery had brought clarity about their situation. Without shelter, supplies, and knowledge appropriate to prairie winter, attempting to reach Fort Kearney remained a death sentence. "What happens now?" she asked simply. Standing Bear studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "You and your daughters are welcome to remain until safe passage is possible." "We cannot be a burden on your family," Margaret replied, though the alternative remained unspoken between them. "Burden comes from those who take without giving," Standing Bear said. "All who share the lodge must contribute to its well-being." He paused, seeming to measure his next words. "You have skills we can use. We have the knowledge you need. Perhaps an exchange would benefit both." Elizabeth, who had been listening from where she helped Wichapi process dried berries, looked up with interest. "What kind of exchange?" Standing Bear gestured around the lodge. "Winter survival requires many skills: finding food beneath snow, preserving what is found, making clothing that truly protects, reading weather signs before storms arrive." His gaze returned to Margaret. "Your daughters are clever with their hands. You have knowledge of white medicines and cloth-making that Wichapi wishes to learn." The proposition was so practical, so stripped of patronizing charity, that Margaret felt immediate relief. To contribute rather than merely receive preserved dignity, something she had lost in Willow Creek's dismissal of her family as helpless. "Burdens. We would be grateful for your teaching," she said, making the decision, "and will share whatever skills we have in return." Thus began an education unlike any the Mitchell girls had experienced, immersive, practical, and literally vital to their survival. Each day brought new lessons, carefully structured by Standing Bear and Wichapi to build competence without overwhelming their novice students. Morning light typically found them gathered around the central fire as Standing Bear explained the day's focus, his English deliberate but increasingly fluid as he grew accustomed to instructing in his second language. Margaret observed with quiet admiration how he adapted teaching methods to each child's age and aptitude, patience with young Clara's endless questions, technical precision for methodical Rebecca, practical applications for action-oriented Sarah, and broader context for thoughtful Elizabeth. "Today, we learned to find food when snow covers everything," he announced a week into their arrangement. The storm had passed, leaving deep drifts but also clear skies and moderating temperatures that made outdoor lessons possible. Bundled in layers that now included rabbit fur-lined mittens which Api had helped them craft, the Mitchells followed, Standing Bear and Akacheta, into the winter landscape. Margaret carried Abigail, though the 5-year-old insisted on being put down periodically to practice walking in the specialized moccasins which Api had made for each of them, winter footwear, vastly superior to their deteriorating leather boots. "The white man sees winter as the death time," Standing Bear explained as they moved through a stand of trees, his breath forming clouds in the crisp air. "The Lakota know it as the waiting time. Life does not end, it hides." He stopped near a snow-covered mound at the base of a cottonwood. "Watch," he instructed, gesturing for Akacheta to demonstrate. The youth knelt, carefully brushing away snow to reveal a tangled mass of dormant plants clinging to the tree's base. "Prairie turnip," Standing Bear identified, using both Lakota and English names for each plant he showed them. "Rich in food that keeps the body strong. The tops die in winter, but underground." He nodded to Akacheta, who used a specialized digging stick to carefully extract several potato-like tubers from the frozen ground. Rebecca's eyes widened. "There's food under the snow?" "For those who know where to look," Standing Bear confirmed. "Each plant has its season, but many store their strength below ground through winter." The lesson continued as they moved through the woodland and onto the prairie edge, where Standing Bear and Akacheta revealed a hidden geography of sustenance beneath the snow's blank page. Wild onions that could be located by the pattern of their dried stalks protruding through drifts, rose hips preserved naturally by winter's cold, and bark from specific trees that could be processed into emergency flour. "The land provides," Standing Bear emphasized, "if we understand its language." Sarah, practical and direct, asked the question likely on all their minds. "Did you learn this from your parents?" Standing Bear nodded. "From my father and mother, who learned from theirs back to the beginning time. Knowledge passes through generations like water through a stream, always moving, always the same." Elizabeth, carrying a small collection of their gathered foods, looked thoughtful. "Our father taught us some things, how to fish, how to garden in summer, but nothing like this." "Different lands require different knowledge," Standing Bear replied without judgment. "Your father's teachings were for his world. Here you need ours." Days took on a rhythm. Mornings dedicated to survival skills with Standing Bear and Akacheta, afternoons to processing and preserving with Wichapi, evenings to crafting and repairing around the lodge fire. The Mitchells' hands grew calloused, their bodies stronger, their eyes more attuned to subtleties of landscape and weather. Wichapi proved as knowledgeable an instructor as her husband, though her teaching style differed. Less verbal explanation, more demonstration and guided practice. Under her patient oversight, even young Clara learned to detect the subtle difference between plants that nourished and those that harmed. "This one makes strong tea for cough," Wichapi explained, showing Margaret and Elizabeth dried leaves from her carefully maintained medicine bundle. "This one," she indicated another small pouch, "stops bleeding when packed in a wound." Margaret, who had maintained a modest herbal knowledge based on her mother's teachings and frontier necessity, found Wichapi's pharmacopoeia both familiar and revolutionary. Many plants she recognized served purposes she'd never imagined, while others, entirely unknown to her, addressed ailments that regularly plagued settler communities. My mother used bone-set tea for fever, Margaret shared one afternoon as they worked together cataloguing Wichapi's winter stores. Is it known to your people? Wichapi nodded, her hands continuing to sort dried plants with practiced efficiency. We call it Zintka Takan, good medicine, works on child fever especially. This pattern of connection, finding threads of shared knowledge between disparate traditions, became increasingly common as days stretched into weeks. Margaret discovered that her sewing skills, while using different materials and techniques, shared fundamental principles with Wichapi's hideworking. The Lakota woman's interest in Margaret's patchwork methods led to an improvised quilting project using scraps of the Mitchells' clothing and small pieces of tanned hide. In turn, the Mitchell girls absorbed Lakota skills with the accelerated capacity of youth. 10-year-old Rebecca proved especially adept at tracking, her methodical mind perfectly suited to detecting the subtle signs animals left in snow. 13-year-old Sarah excelled at fire-making using methods that required neither matches nor paper, skills that would serve her regardless of access to store-bought supplies. 7-year-old Clara, initially the most hesitant around their hosts, blossomed under Wichapi's gentle attention, trailing the Lakota woman like a shadow and mimicking her movements with serious determination. Even little Abigail contributed, her small fingers surprisingly dexterous at sorting seeds and berries. But it was 15-year-old Elizabeth whose transformation proved most profound. She worked alongside Akacheta with growing confidence, their initial awkwardness giving way to a comfortable partnership as they tackled increasingly complex tasks. The Lakota youth, initially reserved, gradually shared more of his knowledge as Elizabeth demonstrated both aptitude and respect. The tracks tell a story, Akacheta explained one morning, kneeling beside a delicate impression in fresh snow while Elizabeth studied it intently. Not just what animal, but how long ago, how fast it moved, whether it was hunting or being hunted. Elizabeth nodded, her breath creating small clouds in the winter air, like reading a book written in the snow. Akacheta considered this comparison. Yes, but the wind turns the page quickly. You must learn to read fast. Their laughter, shared across boundaries of language and upbringing, echoed through the trees, a sound that would have seemed impossible weeks earlier. One evening, as a particularly successful day of foraging and hunting concluded, Standing Bear expanded their education beyond immediate survival skills. As they worked together processing the 2 jackrabbits Akacheta had snared, nothing wasted, every component assigned purpose from meat to bones to fur, he began speaking of Lakota beliefs. All things are connected, he explained, demonstrating how to extract sinew for future use as thread. The rabbit gives life so we may live. We honor this gift by using every part, by remembering the rabbit in our thanks. Sarah, never one to shy from direct questions, looked up from her work separating fur from hide. Do you pray to God for the animals? Standing Bear considered her question with characteristic thoughtfulness. We pray to Wakantanka, the great mystery that flows through all things. Not separate from creation as your God seems to be, but present within everything, the rabbit, the snow, the fire, ourselves. Rather than dismissing this belief, as Margaret had momentarily feared he might, Standing Bear acknowledged it with quiet respect before offering his own perspective. Many paths to understanding the great mysteries. The Lakota way is one path, yours is another. Both seek to honor what is greater than ourselves. This approach, finding connection without demanding conversion, characterized all their cultural exchanges. Standing Bear and Wichapi shared Lakota stories and beliefs as naturally as they shared practical knowledge, presenting them as another essential aspect of prairie wisdom rather than competing doctrine. The Mitchell girls, raised with Protestant Christianity, but without rigid dogma, in their isolated frontier setting, absorbed these teachings with the same openness they applied to learning which plants were edible or how to build a snow shelter. Margaret, whose own faith had been tested by Thomas's death and the community's abandonment, found unexpected comfort in the Lakota worldview that recognized struggle without requiring suffering to have divine purpose. As January deepened its grip on the prairie, the education expanded to include skills for nomadic life once spring returned. Wichapi taught Margaret and Elizabeth the art of quickly dismantling and reassembling their lodge, a tipi designed for portability as the Lakota followed seasonal resources. "When buffalo grass grows new, we leave winter camp," Wichapi explained, demonstrating how specific poles formed the foundation that everything else depended upon. "Lodge must go up quickly, come down quickly. Storms come fast on the prairie." Margaret, who had spent 3 years in a permanent cabin that nonetheless failed to protect her family when community support vanished, recognized the wisdom in mobility, adapted to the environment rather than attempting to force the environment to accommodate fixed structures. Standing Bear, observing her thoughtful examination of the teepee's design, commented quietly, "The white man builds solid homes but often must abandon them. We build homes that move with us, adapting like the grasses bend before wind rather than breaking." The observation, offered without judgment, nonetheless carried profound insight into the fundamental difference between their culture's approaches to the harsh prairie environment. Margaret found herself increasingly questioning assumptions she had never examined, that permanent settlement represented progress, that the Lakota's nomadic traditions reflected primitive development rather than sophisticated adaptation to their environment. Food preparation became another arena of intensive knowledge exchange. The limited provisions Margaret had carried from Willow Creek had been quickly exhausted, forcing complete dependence on Lakota methods of sustenance. Standing Bear and Akacheta brought game, primarily rabbits and occasionally a deer, while daily foraging supplemented their protein with plants preserved by winter's natural refrigeration. Wichapi proved a master of transformation, turning these limited ingredients into varied meals that sustained both nutrition and morale. She taught Margaret and the older girls how to prepare pemmican, a concentrated mixture of dried meat, fat, and berries that provided essential energy in portable form. "Summer food carried into winter," Wichapi explained, showing them the precise proportions that ensured preservation without spoilage. "When we follow buffalo, this keeps us strong between hunts." The preparation required hours of pounding dried meat into powder, using stone tools, measuring precise amounts of rendered fat, and incorporating dried service berries for sweetness and nutrients. The process, labor-intensive but social, became a time for sharing stories and building bonds. During one such session, as their hands worked in rhythmic unison, Wichapi asked Margaret about her life before Willow Creek. The question, simple, yet profound in its recognition of Margaret as someone with history beyond her current circumstances, opened a conversation that ranged across their different experiences of womanhood, motherhood, and survival. Margaret shared memories of her Ohio childhood, her education cut short by family obligations, her marriage to Thomas at 19, and their decision to seek opportunity in Nebraska Territory when eastern prospects dimmed. "Thomas believed in the promise of new land," she explained, her hands continuing their steady work, "a place where his blacksmith skills would provide for us all, where the girls might have better chances than we did." Wichapi listened attentively, her own hands never pausing in their practice movements. When Margaret finished, the Lakota woman shared aspects of her own journey, her childhood in a large band that followed traditional ways, her marriage to Standing Bear, who had chosen to learn both paths after spending time at a mission school, Their decision to winter separately from the main band after tensions arose regarding adaptation to changing circumstances. Standing Bear believes we must learn new ways to survive the coming changes, she explained with quiet dignity. Some elders disagree, say he becomes too much like White Man, so we make winter camp alone this season and return to the band in spring when tempers cool like melting snow. The revelation that their Lakota hosts were themselves navigating complex cultural transitions provided perspective that transformed Margaret's understanding of their situation. This wasn't simply a case of established natives helping ignorant settlers, but rather two families both existing at cultural crossroads, each with knowledge the other needed. By February's arrival, the knowledge exchange had expanded beyond survival. Necessities to encompass language, music, and social customs. Evening gatherings around the central fire might include Standing Bear, teaching Lakota words for essential objects and actions, Akacheta demonstrating songs played on a small hand drum, or Margaret sharing folk tales remembered from her childhood. Mitchell girls, with children's natural facility for language, began incorporating Lakota words into their daily speech. Clara was particularly delighted in mastering new terms, proudly announcing each morning's weather with the appropriate Lakota description. Even Abigail at 5 effortlessly switched between English and simple Lakota phrases, sometimes creating hybrid sentences that bridged both worlds. One evening, as wind drove snow against the teepee's sturdy walls and their shared meal had given way to quiet activities around the fire, Standing Bear addressed Margaret with uncharacteristic hesitation. "Your daughters learn quickly the ways of winter survival," he observed, "but knowledge must continue beyond our teaching." Margaret looked up from the moccasin she was repairing, sensing significance in his tone. "What do you mean?" Standing Bear exchanged glances with Wichapi before continuing. "When spring comes, choices must be made. Fort Kearney offers one path, returning to your people's ways, but such places may not value the knowledge your daughters now carry." Elizabeth, always attentive to undercurrents, set aside the sinew she was processing. "Are you saying we shouldn't go to Fort Kearney when the snow melts?" Standing Bear considered his words carefully. "I say only that knowledge survives when practiced. The skills you learn here, finding food beneath snow, reading weather in cloud patterns, making shelter from what the land provides, these things are not taught in white schools or settlements." "They should be," Sarah interjected with characteristic directness. "They're more useful than half the things we learned in Willow Creek." A ghost of a smile crossed Standing Bear's usually solemn face. "Perhaps, but white settlers often forget old knowledge in favor of new ways, even when old ways serve better in this land." Margaret understood the unspoken question hovering beneath his observation. What would happen to this hard-won knowledge when they inevitably returned to white society? Would the skills that had kept her daughters alive become forgotten curiosities, dismissed as Indian ways, unnecessary in settlements with general stores and community support? "What would you suggest?" she asked, sensing he had given this considerable thought. "Knowledge lives when shared," Standing Bear replied. "Those who carry wisdom between worlds, like water flowing between two lakes, serve both." He gestured toward his son. "Akacheta learns both paths, as I did. He will understand white ways without forgetting Lakota truth." The implication hung in the air, neither demand nor simple observation, but an invitation to consider possibilities beyond the binary choice between returning to white society or remaining permanently with their Lakota hosts. A third path existed, one where the knowledge exchange continued, where the Mitchell family might serve as a bridge between worlds increasingly forced into contact. As the fire burned low and the conversation gave way to sleep preparations, Margaret found her thoughts circling this unexpected proposition. She had come to the Nebraska Territory as part of America's westward expansion, never questioning her place within that movement. Now, through circumstances that should have ended in tragedy, she found herself considering a role she had never imagined: cultural translator, carrier of essential knowledge between colliding worlds. The idea should have seemed outlandish, yet as she watched her daughters settle into their sleeping robes, healthy, learning, adapting in ways they never could have in Willow Creek, she recognized that transformation had already begun. The Mitchell family that emerged from this winter would never again fit neatly into the narrow confines that settler society prescribed. Knowledge, once gained, could not be unlearned. The only question remaining was how they would carry it forward when the spring thaw finally arrived. February's deep freeze began to loosen its grip as March approached. The sun lingered longer in the pale blue sky, and midday temperatures occasionally rose enough to create a thin layer of melt on south-facing snowdrifts. These subtle shifts signaled nature's inevitable progression towards spring, even as nights remained bitterly cold and the prairie landscape predominantly white. With the moderating weather came increased activity beyond their isolated winter camp. Standing Bear returned from hunting one afternoon with news that added a new dimension to their situation. "Riders to the south," he reported, as he and Akacheta brought in a young deer that would sustain them for several days. 3 men on horseback, following the old mail road. Margaret looked up sharply from where she and Wichapi were teaching the younger girls to fashion waterproof containers from birch bark. "Soldiers?" Standing Bear shook his head while helping Akasheta hang the deer in the designated preparation area outside the teepee. "Settlers, 1 wagon heavily loaded, moving before the thaw makes travel easier, unwise but not uncommon." Margaret nodded, understanding the implications. As temperatures moderated and snowpack began to consolidate, human activity across the prairie would increase. Their insulated existence, the careful balance between families that had developed over weeks of isolation, would face external scrutiny. Standing Bear seemed to read her thoughts. "We should prepare for encounters," he said simply. "As paths clear, more will travel." The following morning, he expanded on this concern during their usual council around the breakfast fire. "My people and yours exist in uneasy peace," he explained, particularly addressing Elizabeth and Sarah, who were old enough to understand the complexities of frontier relations. "Treaties made, treaties broken, promises given, promises forgotten. Some bands resist with weapons, others seek accommodation. Some white men respect boundaries, many do not." "Are we in danger?" Sarah asked directly, her practical nature seeking clear assessment rather than comfortable reassurance. Standing Bear considered her question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "All life contains danger, especially during times of change, but specific risks exist when worlds meet." He glanced at Margaret. "A white woman and her daughters living willingly with the Lakota family, this fits no category in either world's understanding." "We're doing nothing wrong," Elizabeth pointed out, a protective edge entering her voice. "Ignorance creates fear. Fear leads to poor decisions," Standing Bear replied. "Not everyone will see with clear eyes what exists between our families." With this reality acknowledged, practical preparations began. Their daily excursions for foraging and hunting now included heightened awareness of potential encounters. Standing Bear taught the older girls to recognize distant riders before being seen themselves, using terrain features for concealment when necessary. Not from fear, he emphasized, but from wisdom. First observation allows better choices. Margaret noticed additional precautions in their hosts' behavior. More careful selection of hunting grounds, frequent scouting before family activities, and subtle adjustments to the teepee's position that made it less visible from common travel routes while maintaining its practical advantages of shelter and drainage. Whichapi took Margaret aside during one of their medicine-gathering expeditions, speaking with uncharacteristic urgency. "You must prepare your daughters for questions," she advised, expertly cutting medicinal roots while scanning the horizon. "If white travelers find you with us, they will make assumptions, create stories that match their understanding." Margaret understood the warning. Frontier settlements bubbled with rumors about white captives among native tribes, stories that rarely acknowledged voluntary association or mutual benefit. Such narratives served to reinforce boundaries between communities, justifying both fear and retaliation. "What would you suggest?" Margaret asked, recognizing Whichapi's greater experience navigating these complex cultural interfaces. The Lakota woman considered carefully. Simple truth is often safest. Winter storm, certain death, rescue and shelter, practical arrangement for survival. She paused, her hands briefly stealing their work. "But leave unclear your plans for after thaw. Such decisions belong to no stranger's judgment." Margaret nodded, appreciating both the practical advice and the respect for autonomy it contained. She began preparing her daughters that evening, gathering them close after Standing Bear's family had retired to their sleeping section of the teepee. "If we encounter other settlers," she explained, keeping her voice low, "we must be careful how we present our situation. Some may not understand the arrangement we've made with Standing Bear's family." "We tell them they saved us from freezing," Clara suggested with 7-year-old directness. "Yes," Margaret agreed, "but we need not share everything, our learning, our future plans. Some things belong only to us." Elizabeth, perceptive as always, studied her mother's face in the dying firelight. "You're worried they might try to separate us from each other or from the Standing Bear's family?" Margaret nodded, unwilling to shield her eldest from difficult truths. "There are those who believe different peoples should remain apart, even when circumstances bring them together. They might not understand what we've found here." "But that's foolish," Sarah objected. "We'd have died without their help, and now we know how to survive in ways we never could have learned in Willow Creek. Wisdom and prejudice rarely travel together," Margaret replied, echoing one of Standing Bear's frequent observations. "All I ask is that you follow my lead if such encounters occur. Let me speak first and foremost." The girls agreed solemnly, even young Abigail nodding with serious eyes that suggested she understood more than her 5 years might indicate. Their preparations proved prescient sooner than expected. 3 days later, as Margaret and Elizabeth worked with Akacheta, checking rabbit snares in a wooded area about a mile from camp, the crack of a rifle shot shattered the winter silence. The sound came from the direction of the main trail, perhaps. Half a mile distant, Akacheta froze instantly, motioning for Margaret and Elizabeth to remain still. He listened intently, his practiced ear assessing the echo. "One shot," he whispered. "Hunting, not fighting." Nevertheless, they abandoned their task and circled back toward the teepee using a route that offered maximum cover. Standing Bear met them halfway, having also heard the shot, and left Whichapi with the younger girls while he investigated. "White hunters," he reported, after conferring briefly with Akacheta in Lakota. "2 men moving north along the creek line. Not following our tracks yet, but their path may cross our hunting grounds." They returned to the teepee and implemented precautions they had previously discussed. The most visible outdoor activities were temporarily suspended, the smoke from their fire minimized by feeding it particular woods that produced less visible output, and a watch rotation established among the adults and older children. By sunset, no further disturbance had occurred, suggesting the hunters had continued northward without detecting their camp. Nevertheless, the incident reinforced the reality that their isolation was ending as seasonal activity increased across the landscape. The following week brought multiple signs of this changing condition. Twice more they heard distant gunshots, though never close enough to pose immediate concern. Akacheta reported fresh wagon tracks on the main trail during a scouting expedition, and Standing Bear observed smoke from what appeared to be a temporary camp several miles southeast of their position. These external pressures subtly altered the dynamic within their shelter. The openness and free exchange that had characterized their knowledge-sharing acquired an edge of urgency, as if both families recognized that their time together might end sooner than anticipated. "We must ensure you can apply these skills without our guidance," Standing Bear emphasized during what had become daily survival instruction. "Knowledge partially gained can be more dangerous than complete ignorance." The Mitchell girls responded to this intensified education with corresponding dedication. Even Clara and Abigail seemed to sense the importance of mastering as much as possible while their Lakota teachers remained available. March's second week brought their first direct encounter with the outside world. Standing Bear and Akacheta had departed before dawn for a longer hunting expedition, hoping to secure larger game as their supplies diminished and spring's arrival remained tantalizingly distant. Margaret and Wichapi used the opportunity to lead the girls to a nearby stream where ice had begun to break up, offering access to fresh water plants that supplemented their diet. They worked efficiently, the older girls helping younger ones identify edible shoots emerging along the stream bank, while Margaret and Wichapi filled containers with clean water from areas where flow had resumed beneath thinning ice. Their attention focused downward on their tasks. They failed to notice approaching riders until the distinctive sound of horses snorting announced their presence. Margaret looked up to find 3 mounted men watching them from the opposite bank, perhaps 30 yards upstream. Their expressions registered surprise, followed by intense curiosity. Exactly the reaction Standing Bear had warned about. A white woman and children working alongside a Lakota woman, all dressed in adapted clothing that blended frontier and native elements, presented a tableau that defied easy categorization. Without appearing rushed, Margaret straightened and positioned herself slightly forward of her daughters and Wichapi. She offered a polite nod, but remained silent, allowing the newcomers to declare their intentions first, another strategy Standing Bear had advised. The central rider, a bearded man in his 40s wearing a fur-trimmed coat that suggested greater prosperity than typical frontier trappers, touched his hat brim in response. "Good day, ma'am," he called across the water. "Wasn't expecting to find white folk in these parts before the spring trains." His tone remained cordial, but Margaret noted how his companions, younger men with rifles resting casually across their saddles, maintained watchful postures that suggested habitual caution in unfamiliar situations. "Good day," Margaret replied, keeping her voice steady and matter-of-fact. "We're gathering early greens. The creek banks thaw first." The man nodded, studying their group with undisguised assessment. "James Harrington," he introduced himself. "These are my sons, William and Thomas. We've established a trading post 20 miles south near the junction of Baldwin Creek and the Republican River." Margaret acknowledged the introduction with appropriate frontier courtesy. "Margaret Mitchell. These are my daughters." She deliberately avoided introducing Wichapi, neither claiming a false relationship nor creating distance through explanation. Harrington's gaze lingered on their odd assemblage, clearly calculating possible scenarios that might explain their presence. "You folks attached to a nearby settlement? Didn't know any homesteaders had pushed this far west of Fort Kearny yet." The question probed for information while appearing casual. Standard frontier interaction where strangers frequently assessed each other for potential threat or advantage. Margaret recognized the delicate balance required in her response. "We're wintering with friends until spring travel becomes safer," she replied, offering truth without specific detail. "The January blizzards caught us between destinations." This explanation, vague yet plausible, seemed to partially satisfy Harrington, though his sons exchanged glances that suggested continued curiosity about their unusual situation. Headed to Fort Kearny when the weather breaks? Harrington asked, the question carrying more weight than its surface simplicity suggested. Before Margaret could respond, young Clara, despite previous instructions to remain quiet, spoke up with childish enthusiasm. Standing Bear says the fort trail will clear when the moon is full again. The name dropped innocently into conversation created immediate tension. Both younger Harringtons straightened in their saddles, hands shifting slightly. Closer to their weapons, the elder Harrington's expression cooled noticeably. Standing Bear, he repeated. Would that be the Lakota scout who sometimes works with the army? Margaret felt Wichapi stiffen beside her, though the Lakota woman's face remained carefully impassive. Elizabeth gently pulled Clara back, murmuring something too quiet for the men to hear. Yes, Margaret confirmed, seeing no benefit in denial when Clara had already revealed their connection. His family provided shelter when the blizzard would have claimed our lives. We've been recovering under their protection. She deliberately emphasized protection rather than captivity, shaping the narrative before Harrington could impose his own interpretation. Nevertheless, the trader's expression remained troubled. Ma'am, while I've had peaceful dealings with various tribes, myself, there's been increased tension lately. Army patrols have reported several incidents with renegade bands pushing back against settler encroachment. He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. Some might question whether your current arrangement is entirely voluntary. The implication that Margaret and her daughters might require rescue from a situation she had just described as life-saving carried all the paternalistic assumptions Standing Bear had warned about. More concerning, it suggested potential intervention justified by presumed distress. Our arrangement is entirely voluntary, Mr. Harrington, Margaret replied firmly, and mutually beneficial. My daughters and I have learned prairie survival skills that will serve us well in our future settlement, wherever that may be. Harrington nodded, though skepticism remained evident in his expression. Of course, ma'am. Still, our trading post offers proper accommodations if you and your girls would prefer more. Conventional shelter until travel conditions improve. My wife would welcome female company after months with just us men around. The offer, generous on its surface, carried unmistakable subtext. Return to appropriate social arrangements among your own kind. Margaret recognized both the expectation embedded in Harrington's invitation and the potential consequences of direct refusal. That's very kind, she responded diplomatically. We'll certainly keep your trading post in mind as we consider our spring journey plans. This non-committal answer appeared to satisfy Harrington's sense of propriety without requiring immediate action. He touched his hat brim again. We'll be heading back south tomorrow. Should pass within a mile or so of here around midday if you reconsider. With that conditional farewell, the Harringtons turned their horses and continued downstream, though Margaret noticed the younger men glancing back several times until terrain features obscured their view. Once certain the riders were beyond earshot, Wichapi spoke quietly in the mixture of English and Lakota they had developed for complex communication. They will bring others, perhaps soldiers. Margaret nodded, having reached the same conclusion. Not tomorrow. That would be too obvious after their offer. But soon. Harrington strikes me as a man who believes he knows what's best for others, especially women without male protection. They gathered their collected plants and water quickly, returning to the tipi by a circuitous route that avoided leaving obvious tracks between the stream and their shelter. Standing Bear and Akacheta returned shortly before dusk, a successful hunt evidenced by the field-dressed elk they transported on a travois. The men's satisfaction at their hunting success vanished as Margaret described the encounter with the Harringtons. Standing Bear listened without interruption, though his expression darkened progressively. Traders know many people, spread many words, he observed when she finished. This Harrington will not forget finding white women and children with Lakota. You families. Should we leave? Elizabeth asked, voicing the question that hung unspoken in the teepee's suddenly tense atmosphere. Find another campsite? Standing Bear exchanged glances with Wichapi before responding. Moving camp in winter carries risk. Food sources known here might not be found elsewhere, but staying brings different dangers. What kind of danger? Sarah asked directly. Standing Bear considered how to explain complex frontier dynamics to a 13-year-old. Some white men believe all native people are enemies. Some believe white women need rescue whether they ask for it or not. These beliefs make them act in ways that create trouble where none existed, like Mayor Wilson, Rebecca observed with unexpected insight. He thought he knew what was best for us too. Yes, Margaret agreed, surprised and impressed by her 10-year-old's perception. Exactly like that. After thorough discussion weighing various factors, they decided to maintain their current camp but implement additional precautions. Their outdoor activities would become more circumspect, with careful attention to tracking and concealment. A secondary shelter would be prepared in a location known only to their extended group, providing alternative refuge if their main camp were discovered. Most significantly, Standing Bear decided that he and Akacheta would not hunt together going forward. One would always remain near the teepee, ensuring capable protection if unexpected visitors arrived with questionable intentions. That night, as the children slept and adults maintained watch rotation, Margaret found herself contemplating how thoroughly her perspective had transformed. 3 months earlier, she would have viewed men like the Harringtons as potential saviors, representatives of a social order that provided security through conformity. Now she recognized the limitations inherent in that order, particularly for those who existed at its margins. Standing Bear joined her by the carefully banked fire during his watch, his expression thoughtful as he added small pieces of wood that produced heat with minimal smoke. The worlds move closer together, he observed quietly. What happens in this small lodge between our families happens across the prairie. Knowledge shared, boundaries questioned, new ways emerging from old collisions. Margaret nodded, understanding his broader perspective, but not everyone welcomes such change. Change comes whether welcomed or resisted, Standing Bear replied. Like spring thaw, it can nourish new growth or flood and destroy, depending on how it is channeled. The metaphor captured their immediate situation perfectly. External forces, represented by the Harringtons but extending to the larger currents of westward expansion, were accelerating toward their small community. The coming days would determine whether these forces would nurture the cross-cultural understanding they had cultivated or sweep it away in rigid adherence to established boundaries. The following days brought increased tension as they implemented their precautionary measures while continuing essential activities. Standing Bear and Akacheta alternated hunting expeditions with defensive preparations, including establishing observation points that provided early warning of approaching riders. Their vigilance proved warranted when 5 days after the stream encounter, Akacheta reported 4 riders approaching from the south. The Harrington party supplemented by an additional figure in what appeared to be partial military uniform. Not a full soldier, Akacheta clarified, after observing them through a spyglass Standing Bear had acquired during army scouting work. Perhaps a fort scout or militia. The implication was clear. Harrington had indeed shared news of their unusual arrangement with authorities, likely framing it as potential captivity requiring investigation. The addition of someone with quasi-official status transformed a trader's curiosity into something approaching official intervention. They followed. Our tracks from hunting yesterday, Akacheta continued, will find a lodge by midday unless we mislead them. Standing Bear made an immediate decision. Margaret and daughters moved to a second shelter with Wichapi. Akacheta and I will meet these riders away from both camps, suggesting you travelled onward to Fort Kearney days ago. The plan made tactical sense, yet Margaret found herself reluctant to implement what felt like retreat. Running and hiding makes us appear guilty of something, she objected. We've done nothing wrong. Not guilty. Wisdom, Standing Bear countered. Confrontation brings unpredictable outcomes. Better to direct the river around the stone than try to move the stone while the river floods. His logic prevailed. Within the hour, Margaret and her daughters had relocated to the secondary shelter, a smaller, more concealed structure they had prepared specifically for this contingency. Wichapi accompanied them, bringing essential supplies, while leaving enough materials in the main tipi to suggest temporary hunting absence, rather than permanent departure. From their hidden vantage point in a dense thicket, backed against a small rise, they could observe without being seen as Standing Bear and Akacheta intercepted the Harrington party well away from either camp. The conversation appeared tense, even at distance, with much gesturing and periodic consultation of what might have been a map. After nearly 30 minutes of discussion, the riders departed southward, not entirely satisfied, judging by their body language, but apparently accepting whatever explanations Standing Bear had provided. When the Lakota men returned to the secondary shelter, Standing Bear explained the encounter. They sought white women and children seen with Indians near Baldwin Creek. I told them truth transformed, that we found a family in a snowstorm, sheltered them until the weather improved, then directed them toward Fort Kearney 2 weeks past. Did they believe you? Elizabeth asked. Standing Bear's expression remained neutral. The one in soldier clothes doubted, wanted to search our camp. I said all are welcome as guests by Lakota custom, but reminded that the treaty allows no military entry to hunting grounds without permission from chiefs. This legal reminder, demonstrating Standing Bear's sophisticated understanding of treaty provisions that many settlers chose to ignore, had apparently created sufficient uncertainty to prevent immediate search. They go now to Fort Kearney, Standing Bear continued. We'll ask if the Mitchell family arrived. When no Mitchells are found there, they may return with more questions, perhaps more men. The threat, while temporarily averted, had clearly escalated. Their previously isolated existence had now entered frontier consciousness, transforming from private arrangement to potential public concern. The knowledge exchange that had flourished in isolation would face its greatest challenge as external. Forces sought to categorize and control what they perceived as boundary transgression. That evening, as they maintained heightened vigilance from their secondary shelter, Margaret realized they had reached the critical juncture Standing Bear had predicted weeks earlier. The spring thaw approached, both literal in the warming temperatures and metaphorical in the increased human activity across the prairie landscape. Choices postponed during winter's isolation could no longer be deferred. The Mitchell family stood at crossroads that would determine not just their immediate safety, but their future identity in a rapidly changing frontier world. For 3 tense days, the combined family maintained their position in the secondary shelter, a structure more concealed, but less comfortable than their main teepee. They limited outdoor activities to essential tasks, kept fires small and smokeless, and maintained constant vigilance through a rotation of lookouts positioned on the small rise that provided visibility across the surrounding prairie. On the 4th morning, Akacheta returned from dawn scouting with news that shifted their immediate concerns. Smoke from the east, he reported, crouching beside the small breakfast fire where Standing Bear and Margaret discussed the day's necessary activities. Many fires, perhaps a camp of my people moving north earlier than usual. Standing Bear considered this information with characteristic thoughtfulness. Which band? Too distant to be certain, Akacheta replied, but the pattern suggests Minakunju or perhaps Oglala. The potential proximity of a larger Lakota group introduced new dimensions to their already complex situation. Standing Bear explained to Margaret as Wichapi prepared a simple breakfast of pemmican mixed with early spring greens. Different bands follow different leaders, he clarified. Some maintain traditional separation from white settlements, others engage in limited trade. My own contacts with white military mark me as controversial among certain groups. Would they be hostile to us? Margaret asked, glancing toward her daughters, who were helping Wichapi with meal preparations, too far away to overhear their discussion. Not hostile, Standing Bear replied carefully, but questioning. A white family living with Lakota raises concerns on both sides of the divide. Some of my people fear white influence weakens traditional ways, just as some whites fear native influence threatens their civilization. Margaret nodded, understanding the parallels. Mirror fears. Yes, Standing Bear agreed, pleased by her perception. Fear wears different clothing, but speaks with the same voice in both camps. He made a decision, rising to his feet with quiet authority. I must investigate this band. If they are Miniconjou, as Akecheta suspects, the leader may be Black Eagle, who once fought beside my father. Such a connection might offer protection beyond what our small family can provide. The implications hung clearly in the morning air. Potential alliance with a larger Lakota group might deter further intervention from settlers like Harrington, but would also permanently align the Mitchell family with native interests in the eyes of white authorities. And if they object to our presence, Margaret asked directly. Standing Bear met her gaze with characteristic honesty. Then we face difficulty from both directions. White soldiers questioning why you remain with us, Lakota leaders questioning why we shelter you. He instructed Akecheta to continue monitoring both the distant Lakota encampment and potential approaches from the south where Harrington might return. Then, with minimal preparation, Standing Bear departed eastward to make contact with the newly arrived band. His absence altered the dynamics within their shelter, highlighting how central his quiet leadership had become to their collective security. Wichapi maintained outward calm, but Margaret noticed her frequent glances toward the eastern horizon as the day progressed. That evening, as they gathered around the small cooking fire within their concealed shelter, Elizabeth voiced the question that had likely occupied all their thoughts. What happens if Standing Bear can't return? If this other band doesn't welcome him, or us? Wichapi looked up from the stew she was preparing, her usually composed expression revealing momentary vulnerability. My husband walks a difficult path between worlds, has done so many seasons. He will return. Her certainty provided reassurance, but Margaret recognized the underlying reality. Their security, perhaps their survival, now depended on diplomatic negotiations occurring beyond their knowledge or control. Margaret used the opportunity to engage her daughters in a necessary discussion. Whatever happens with Standing Bear's mission, we need to consider our path forward when spring truly arrives. Sarah, practical as always, framed the question directly. Do we still try to reach Fort Kearney, or return to Willow Creek? Rebecca added, though her tone suggested little enthusiasm for revisiting the community that had essentially abandoned them. Or, Elizabeth began, then hesitated, glancing toward Wichapi, who continued her cooking without interrupting this family conversation. Or something else entirely, Margaret completed her daughter's thought. That's what we need to consider. She had deliberately chosen this moment, with Standing Bear temporarily absent, to explore her daughter's perspectives without their feeling pressured by his presence. The winter's extraordinary circumstances had transformed them all, but children's adaptability sometimes masked underlying anxieties about disruption and change. I don't want to go back to Willow Creek, Clara declared with 7-year-old directness. Mayor Wilson is mean, and nobody helped us when we needed it. "And I don't want to go somewhere where we can't use what we've learned," Sarah added, her 13-year-old mind focused on practical applications rather than social considerations. "What's the point of knowing how to find food under snow or make medicine from plants if we just end up in some fort where everything comes from a storehouse?" Margaret nodded, acknowledging their perspectives while nudging toward deeper reflection. "And what about being around other children, other families like us? Don't you miss that sometimes?" The question provoked thoughtful silence. Finally, Elizabeth responded, her 15 years bringing greater awareness of social complexities. "I used to think we needed to be around people like us to belong," she said slowly. "But what does like us even mean anymore? The people who were supposedly like us in Willow Creek left us to freeze. The people who were supposedly different saved us and taught us to survive." Rebecca, 10 years old but observant beyond her age, added her perspective. "Besides, Akecheta and his parents are more like family now than anyone in Willow Creek ever was, except maybe the schoolteacher who left last year." This spontaneous redefinition of family beyond blood relations and racial boundaries touched Margaret deeply. The winter's shared experiences had created bonds her children now valued above conventional community ties. Wichapi, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke as she served the evening meal. "Children see the truth. Adults sometimes forget," she observed quietly. "Bonds formed in survival stronger than those formed in comfort." Late the following afternoon, Standing Bear returned, his expression revealing complex news before he spoke. The girls spotted him first, Clara calling out excitedly as his familiar figure appeared on the horizon. They gathered at the shelter's entrance, maintaining the discipline of not rushing out into open terrain, but barely containing their evident relief at his safe return. Once inside, Standing Bear confirmed Akecheta's assessment. The smoke, indeed, came from a significant Lakota encampment, primarily Miniconjou, with some Oglala families, moving north earlier than usual due to rumors of increased military patrols along their traditional spring routes. "Black Eagle leads them," he explained, accepting the warm tea Wichapi prepared. "As I hoped, he remembers my father with respect." "Did you tell him about us?" Elizabeth asked, unable to contain her curiosity. Standing Bear nodded, his expression suggesting the conversation had been complicated. "Truth serves better than deception in such matters. I explained how we found your family in a snowstorm, how knowledge has been exchanged through winter moons. And," Margaret prompted when he paused, "Black Eagle is considering," Standing Bear replied carefully. "Such an arrangement between white family and Lakota creates questions for tribal leaders balancing traditional ways with changing times." He sipped his tea before continuing. "He has invited us to bring you to their council tomorrow. They wish to see these white women who choose to learn Lakota ways rather than return to settlements. The invitation, essentially a summons to inspection and judgment, carried both opportunity and risk." Margaret understood immediately that their reception by this larger band would significantly influence their available options moving forward. "Is it safe?" she asked directly. "You would be under my protection as guests," Standing Bear replied, "and Black Eagle has given word of safe passage, but I cannot promise how all will receive you. Some young warriors question any cooperation with whites after broken treaties and encroachment on hunting grounds." Margaret weighed this honest assessment against their increasingly precarious position. Harrington and his quasi-military companion might return with reinforcements any day. Their small group lacked numbers for effective defense if confrontation arose. Alliance with Black Eagle's band offered potential protection and legitimacy that their isolated family unit couldn't provide alone. "We'll go," she decided, meeting the Standing Bear's gaze with determined clarity. "All of us together." The journey to the Lakota encampment the following morning required careful preparation. Margaret and her daughters wore clothing that represented their unique position, frontier dresses adapted with Lakota-influenced elements that Whichapi had helped them create during winter months. They were neither attempting to appear as native women nor presenting as conventional settlers, but rather acknowledging the cultural bridge they now occupied. Standing Bear insisted they travel as a family unit rather than separate groups, positioning himself at the front, with Margaret and Elizabeth immediately behind, Whichapi and the younger girls in the middle, and Akacheta bringing up the rear. This formation conveyed both protection and unity as they approached the sprawling camp that had appeared on the eastern horizon. The encampment proved larger than Margaret had anticipated, perhaps 40 teepees arranged in traditional circular pattern, with horses picketed nearby and the everyday activities of several hundred people creating a busy, self-contained community. Their approach drew immediate attention, activities pausing as adults noticed the unusual group walking deliberately toward the central council area. Standing Bear maintained dignified confidence as they entered the camp's outer perimeter, acknowledging greetings from those who recognized him, while continuing purposefully toward a large tipi decorated with symbols of tribal leadership. Children stared openly at the Mitchell girls, their curiosity unmasked by adult restraint. Dogs barked and circled their procession until called back by their owners. Outside, the council teepee stood several older men, including one whose bearing and ceremonial attire marked him as a significant leader. Black Eagle, Margaret surmised, correctly. His weathered face revealed little emotion as they approached, though his gaze moved assessingly over each member of their group. Standing Bear stopped at a respectful distance, speaking first in Lakota, a formal greeting Margaret had heard him practice that morning before switching to English for the benefit of her family. Black Eagle, I bring my family and our winter companions as invited for council, he said simply. The older chief nodded once, his English heavily accented but clear. We will speak inside. The women and children may rest at fire while men talk. Standing, Bear glanced at Margaret, a subtle communication passing between them before he responded. With respect, elder brother, the Mitchell woman should join our council. She leads her family as I lead mine. Her voice should be heard in matters concerning their future. This request, unconventional by both Lakota and white standards, created a momentary tension. Black Eagle studied Margaret with increased interest, seeming to reassess based on Standing Bear's unexpected advocacy. After a measured silence, he nodded again. Unusual times may require unusual councils. The mother may enter, others will wait. Margaret squeezed Elizabeth's hand reassuringly before following Standing Bear and Black Eagle into the council tipi, where several other men of evident status awaited. The interior, much larger than their winter shelter, allowed for a formal circle around a central fire. Margaret was directed to sit beside Standing Bear, the only woman among a dozen tribal leaders. What followed was unlike any negotiation Margaret had previously witnessed. Black Eagle began by asking Standing Bear to recount their winter arrangement, in full detail, interrupting occasionally for clarification, but otherwise listening with complete attention. Other council members remained silent during this initial narrative, though their expressions revealed varying reactions from skepticism to interest. When Standing Bear finished, Black Eagle turned to Margaret. Now we would hear the woman's words. Why does White Mother with 5 daughters choose Lakota shelter over returning to her own people? The directness of the question cut through potential diplomatic evasions. Margaret recognized that honesty would serve better than calculation in this forum. Our own people abandoned us to die, she replied simply. When my husband passed, our settlement decided 5 daughters and a widow required more resources than they wished to provide. They offered to separate our family, sending my older girls to work as servants, while my youngest and I became dependent on charity. She met Black Eagle's steady gaze. Standing Bear and his family offered something different, not charity, but partnership. They taught us to provide for ourselves in ways our own community never bothered to share. They respected us as capable, rather than treating us as burdens. One of the younger council members spoke in Lakota, his tone suggesting skepticism. Black Eagle responded briefly, before translating for Margaret's benefit. He asks why we should believe a white woman would choose native ways, when history shows your people believe their ways are superior in all things. Margaret considered her response carefully. I cannot speak for all white settlers, just as you cannot speak for all Lakota. But my family has learned that wisdom doesn't belong exclusively to any people. The methods Standing Bear and Wichapi taught us for finding food beneath snow, for making medicine from plants that white doctors ignore, for building shelter that breathes with the seasons rather than fighting against them. These represent knowledge my people have forgotten or never learned. Her answer appeared to resonate with several council members, who nodded slightly as Standing Bear provided occasional Lakota translation for concepts difficult to express in English. The questioning continued for nearly an hour, probing Margaret's intentions, her understanding of territorial disputes between settlers and native peoples, and her plans once full spring arrived. Throughout, she maintained honest directness, neither apologizing for her settler origins nor pretending to fully embrace Lakota identity. We stand between worlds now, she explained when asked where her family might ultimately settle. My daughters have learned to value both the education of books and schools I can provide, and the practical wisdom of living in harmony with this land that Standing Bear's family has shared. I seek a path that honors both. As the council session concluded, Black Eagle conferred briefly with his advisors before addressing Margaret and Standing Bear together. Your unusual arrangement creates questions among both my people and yours, he acknowledged. Some young warriors believe any cooperation with whites weakens our resistance against those who take our hunting grounds. Some of your settlements would view your daughters as requiring rescue rather than respecting your choices. He studied them both with the measured assessment of a leader accustomed to weighing complex factors. Yet Standing Bear's father was my friend in youth, and his son has earned respect among our people through honest dealings. The woman speaks with a straight tongue rather than forked words we often hear from white leaders. His decision, when delivered, offered neither complete acceptance or rejection. You may establish camp at the eastern edge of our circle until the full moon. This allows time for my people to observe your family, for your daughters to meet our children, for council to determine if a longer arrangement serves both interests. This probationary acceptance, provisional but genuine, represented more opportunity than Margaret had dared hope for. Standing Bear's slight nod indicated he considered it a favorable outcome given the circumstances. By sunset, they had established their winter tipi at the designated position on the encampment's perimeter, creating a physical manifestation of their status, connected to, but not fully integrated within the larger Lakota community. The Mitchell girls, initially uncertain amid so many strangers, gradually began interactions with curious Lakota children who approached their temporary home with a mixture of caution and interest. That evening, as her daughters finally slept, after a day of unprecedented experiences, Margaret sat with Standing Bear and Wichapi outside their teepee, watching the larger camp's nighttime activities gradually quiet as fires burned low. Black Eagle offers significant opportunity through this arrangement, Standing Bear observed quietly. His influence extends beyond his immediate band. If he ultimately accepts your family's presence, other Lakota leaders may reconsider rigid boundaries between our peoples. And if military authorities or settlers like Harrington return, Margaret asked, voicing the concern that remained despite their provisional acceptance. Black Eagle's band represents serious consideration for even military commanders, Standing Bear replied. Confrontation with an established group differs greatly from questioning an isolated family. Documentation exists at Fort Kearney acknowledging Black Eagle as a legitimate representative of Minneconjou interests. The practical protection offered by association with a recognized tribal leader provided immediate security. Yet Margaret recognized that their situation remained fundamentally liminal, existing in the uncertain threshold between established categories. We belong nowhere and everywhere, she mused, watching distant campfires flicker across the expansive circle of teepees, not fully settled, not fully Lakota. Perhaps such an in-between place becomes its own belonging, Wichapi suggested, her perspective as wife to a cultural intermediary offering unique insight. New paths formed where old paths meet. The philosophical possibility resonated with Margaret's emerging understanding of their situation. The winter's extraordinary circumstances had placed her family on a journey without a clear destination, one that challenged fundamental assumptions about identity, community, and belonging. 3 days into their probationary residence, an unexpected development accelerated their decision timeline. Ekacheta, maintaining his scouting responsibilities despite their changed location, reported riders approaching from the southwest, a group larger than Harrington's previous party, with distinctive military uniformity to their formation. 8 riders, he reported to Standing Bear and Margaret as they gathered quickly outside their teepee. 2 in full soldier dress, others in partial uniform. They follow our trail from winter camp. The approach of what appeared to be official military delegation rather than frontier militia created immediate implications for their situation. Standing Bear immediately sought audience with Black Eagle, returning shortly with both the chief and 2 respected warriors. Military approaches with questions, Black Eagle confirmed after hearing Akacheta's report. Better to meet them beyond camp boundaries than allow entry to our circle. He studied Margaret thoughtfully. This matter concerns your family directly. You should accompany our greeting party to speak your own truth. The invitation to participate in diplomatic engagement, rather than being spoken for, represented significant respect. Margaret nodded agreement, asking Elizabeth to maintain responsibility for her younger sisters during this critical interaction. As they prepared to depart, 15-year-old Elizabeth pulled her mother aside, her expression reflecting maturity. Beyond her years, whatever happens, we don't want to be separated, she said quietly, clearly speaking for all her sisters. Not from each other, and not from Standing Bear's family. We've survived because we stayed together. The statement, simple, yet profound in its clarity, crystallized Margaret's evolving perspective. Whatever options emerged from the approaching confrontation, maintaining the connections that had sustained them through winter remained her daughter's priority. Their identity had fundamentally shifted, no longer defined primarily by settlement, expectations, but by relationships that transcended conventional boundaries. I understand, Margaret assured her eldest, embracing her briefly before joining Standing Bear, Black Eagle, and the 2 warriors for the ride toward their approaching visitors. The small delegation departed with clear purpose, positioning themselves strategically on a small rise that provided both visibility and tactical advantage for the coming encounter. As the military party came into clear view, Margaret recognized the significance of the moment. The choices made in the coming hours would determine not just their immediate circumstances, but their future identity in a rapidly transforming frontier world. The Mitchell family stood at crossroads that offered no simple return to former certainties, only the possibility of forging new paths through unprecedented terrain. The small delegation positioned themselves atop the gentle rise, presenting a dignified reception committee rather than a defensive barrier. Black Eagle took central position with Standing Bear and Margaret flanking him, while the two warriors maintained slightly distanced positions that suggested both respect and vigilance. They waited in composed silence as the military party approached. Dust rising from the horses' hooves in the late March sunshine, Margaret studied the oncoming riders with growing certainty that this encounter would define their future path. The two men in full military uniform, an officer and sergeant, judging by their insignia, led the formation. Behind them rode 6 men in partial uniform, suggesting militia or scout status rather than regular army. James Harrington's distinctive bearded profile was visible among them, confirming Margaret's suspicion that the trader had escalated his concerns to official channels. As the riders drew within proper speaking distance, Black Eagle raised his hand in a universal gesture for halt. The officer, a captain by his shoulder boards, signaled his party to stop, studying the reception committee with evident surprise at its composition. "I am Captain Robert Langley, United States Army, Fort Kearny Command," he announced formally. "I seek information regarding settlers reported to be living among natives in this territory." His gaze moved from Black Eagle to Margaret with poorly concealed astonishment at finding a white woman accompanying Lakota leadership. Harrington, positioned several horses back, wore an expression suggesting vindication of his reports. Black Eagle responded with the measured dignity of a leader accustomed to diplomatic engagement. "I am Black Eagle, representing Minneconjou, Lakota. This woman Mitchell speaks for herself. Standing Bear speaks for his family, who sheltered hers through winter moons." Captain Langley focused on Margaret, reassessing the situation based on her apparently voluntary presence. "Mrs. Mitchell, James Harrington reported finding a white woman and children living under concerning circumstances with natives. Is that you?" Margaret met his gaze directly, understanding the critical importance of establishing agency rather than victimhood from the beginning. "I am Margaret Mitchell, formerly of Willow Creek Settlement. My 5 daughters and I were abandoned by our community after my husband's death. When winter storms threatened our lives, Standing Bear's family provided shelter and taught us survival skills that saved us from certain death." The captain's expression revealed a struggle between preconceptions and the evidence before him. "And you remain with them voluntarily. You and your children are under no compulsion or restraint." "Entirely voluntarily," Margaret confirmed, her voice steady with conviction. "Our arrangement has been one of mutual exchange and benefit, not captivity." Harrington urged his horse forward, addressing the captain without awaiting permission. "Sir, with respect, the woman may feel compelled to speak favorably while in their presence. If you would allow me to—" "Mr. Harrington, you've fulfilled your duty by reporting your concerns," Langley interrupted with the clipped authority of a professional soldier addressing a civilian. "Please allow me to conduct official inquiries without interference." The rebuke, though mild, established proper protocol and prevented Harrington from dominating the interaction. Margaret noted the captain's professionalism with cautious optimism. Perhaps here was an official capable of seeing beyond simplistic narratives about Indian captives and settler victims. Captain Langley returned his attention to Margaret. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm obligated to investigate reported concerns about settler welfare in territories under military jurisdiction. Would you and your children be willing to accompany us to Fort Kearny for proper debriefing and assessment of your situation?" The question, phrased as request rather than command, nonetheless carried a clear expectation that Margaret would naturally prefer returning to civilization now that military escort was available. Before she could respond, Black Eagle spoke, with quiet authority. "Mitchell's family are currently guests of Minneconjou camp under my protection," he stated. Treaty recognizes the rights of Lakota to determine visitors within our territory. If a woman chooses to remain as guest, the military has no standing to demand otherwise. This assertion of sovereign authority, technically accurate under treaties, that remained valid despite frequent violations, shifted the diplomatic terrain. Captain Langley straightened in his saddle, recognizing the delicate balance between military objectives and avoiding unnecessary conflict with a significant Lakota band. "No demands have been made, Chief Black Eagle," he clarified carefully. "My inquiry was directed to Mrs. Mitchell regarding her preferences." All attention returned to Margaret, the critical decision now plainly before her. She felt the weight of responsibility, not just for her daughter's immediate safety, but for their future identity and relationship with both cultures that had shaped their extraordinary winter journey. "Captain Langley, I appreciate the Army's concern for our welfare," she began, choosing words that acknowledged his authority while maintaining her autonomy. "However, our winter experience has transformed our understanding of survival on these plains. My daughters and I have learned irreplaceable skills from Standing Bear's family that will serve us regardless of where we ultimately settle." She gestured toward the Lakota encampment visible in the distance. "We currently reside at the edge of Black Eagle's camp by mutual agreement, neither fully integrated nor separate. This arrangement allows us to maintain connections with both worlds while determining our long-term path." Captain Langley studied her with increased interest, his expression suggesting reassessment of the situation's complexity. "And what exactly do you envision as your long-term path, Mrs. Mitchell? Surely you don't intend permanent residence with a nomadic tribe?" The question cut to the heart of their liminal status, the fundamental uncertainty about where a family that had crossed cultural boundaries might ultimately belong. Margaret had considered this question extensively during their winter isolation, but Black Eagle's provisional acceptance had opened possibilities previously unimagined. "My intention is to establish a permanent homestead near the trading crossroads, 15 miles south of here," she replied with deliberate clarity, "a location that would allow my family to maintain connections with both settler communities and Lakota bands moving through traditional territories." This concrete plan, developed through conversations with Standing Bear but never previously articulated to outside authorities, seemed to surprise everyone present, including Harrington, whose expression revealed calculation of potential commercial implications. "A homestead requires filing proper claims with territorial authorities," Captain Langley observed, neither endorsing nor rejecting her proposal, "and construction beyond what a woman with 5 young daughters could reasonably manage." "Alone, I am aware of legal requirements," Margaret acknowledged. "As for construction, Standing Bear's family has agreed to assist in exchange for my establishing a small school that would serve both settler and native children seeking education that bridges cultural understanding." This vision, ambitious but practically grounded, represented the synthesis of their winter's transformation. Not retreat into either cultural extreme, but creation of something new at the intersection of worlds increasingly forced into contact across the frontier. Landscape. Black Eagle, who had remained silent during this exchange, now spoke with measured consideration. "Such an arrangement holds potential benefits for both peoples. Children learning both ways may avoid conflicts caused by ignorance." Captain Langley's professional demeanor couldn't entirely mask his surprise at finding sophisticated diplomatic exchange rather than the simple rescue scenario Harrington had likely presented. After a thoughtful pause, he responded with careful formality. "I have no authority to approve or deny civilian settlement plans that comply with territorial regulations," he stated. "My concern is specifically the welfare of Mrs. Mitchell and her children under unusual circumstances reported to Fort Kearny authorities." He addressed Margaret directly. If you'll permit, I'd like to speak with your daughters as well. Their perspectives would complete my assessment of this situation. The request was reasonable from a military protocol perspective, while still acknowledging Margaret's parental authority. She nodded agreement, and arrangements were made for Captain Langley and his sergeant to visit their teepee at the edge of Black Eagle's camp. The remaining militia would establish a temporary position nearby, but outside the Lakota encampment boundaries, a compromise that maintained military presence without suggesting threatening incursion. Harrington clearly wished to accompany the Captain Butt was diplomatically instructed to remain with the militia unit, his frustrated expression suggesting thwarted plans for how this encounter should have proceeded. The meeting at the Mitchell family's teepee later that afternoon proceeded with unexpected positive energy. Captain Langley, who revealed himself as father to 3 daughters back in Pennsylvania, demonstrated genuine interest in the girls' winter experiences. His questions, directed appropriately to each daughter's age, focused on their learning, their comfort, and most significantly, their own preferences regarding their future. Elizabeth, speaking with the poise of a young woman rather than child, described specific survival skills she had mastered under Akacheta's guidance. Sarah displayed practical knowledge of plant medicines that clearly impressed the captain's sergeant, himself a frontier-raised soldier with appreciation for indigenous knowledge. Even young Clara and Abigail contributed enthusiastic descriptions of their winter activities, completely absent the fear or distress that would have marked genuine captivity. When Rebecca proudly demonstrated a small bow she had crafted under Standing Bear's instruction, explaining its use for hunting small game that supplemented their winter diet, Captain Langley exchanged glances with his sergeant that suggested professional reassessment of the situation. "You have remarkable daughters, Mrs. Mitchell," the captain observed as their interview concluded. "Their adaptability speaks well of both your parenting and the environment Standing Bear's family provided during extraordinary circumstances." His official assessment, delivered with military precision, provided crucial legitimacy to their unusual arrangement. "I find no evidence of coercion or distress that would justify military intervention in your current living situation. Your proposed homestead and educational establishment, while unconventional, appears consistent with territorial development objectives." Before departing, he offered practical assistance that reflected both professional responsibility and personal respect for their situation. "I'll register your preliminary homestead claim with Fort Kearny authorities upon our return. This provides 90 days to establish physical residence before formal filing becomes necessary." With unexpected consideration, he added, "I'll also inform Major Williams, the fort commander, of Standing Bear's significant assistance to a settler family." Such positive interactions between communities deserve official acknowledgement, particularly given recent tensions along other sections of the frontier. As Captain Langley and his sergeant rejoined their waiting party, Margaret realized their family had crossed a crucial threshold. Official military assessment had neither rejected their unconventional arrangement nor demanded immediate return to conventional settler society. Instead, it had acknowledged their agency in crafting a new path that respected both cultural traditions while creating something unique at their intersection. That evening, a council fire burned at the center of Black Eagle's camp, larger than usual to accommodate the expanded circle of participants. The Mitchell family sat between Standing Bear's family and selected tribal leaders, their position physically manifesting their bridging status within the community. Margaret noted several younger warriors whose initially suspicious expressions had softened after Captain Langley's respectful interactions demonstrated that not all military representatives approached native communities with hostility or contempt. Black Eagle opened the council with formal acknowledgement of recent developments. Today, we witnessed an unusual meeting between worlds often separated by mistrust, he observed, the firelight casting deep shadows across his weathered features. Military men came seeking white captives, found instead families sharing knowledge across boundaries others believe cannot be crossed. His gaze moved deliberately around the circle, including the Mitchell girls in his address, rather than speaking only to adults. Council has considered the Mitchell family at the edge of our camp. Standing Bear speaks of winter moons, where knowledge passed between lodges like water between cupped hands, not diminished by sharing but sustaining all who receive. The poetic phrasing translated beautifully even through language differences, capturing the essence of their extraordinary winter exchange. Margaret felt Elizabeth's hand slip into hers as the chief continued. Mitchell's mother speaks of building a permanent lodge near trading paths, establishing a place where children of both peoples might learn each other's wisdom. Black Eagle's expression remained solemn, though Margaret detected subtle approval in his tone. Such a vision requires courage from both sides of the divided river, requires those willing to build bridges rather than barriers. The council's decision, when delivered, offered more than Margaret had dared hope for. Miniconjou Council grants Mitchell family status of Tiospaye Mitawa, connected family, not Lakota by blood, but bound by shared experience and mutual respect. The Standing Bears family will continue guiding their path between worlds, and when necessary, our warriors will ensure their protection against those who understand only separation, not connection. This designation, neither full adoption nor mere tolerance, created a formalized relationship unprecedented in either culture's traditional structures. It acknowledged the Mitchell family's unique position while extending meaningful protection beyond what isolated settlers could typically expect. In practical terms, it meant Lakota riders would occasionally visit their homestead, ensuring their safety during vulnerable early establishment. It meant Margaret's proposed school would receive Black Eagle's endorsement, encouraging participation from Lakota families interested in preparing their children for changing frontier realities. Most significantly, it meant the Mitchell family's bridge-building vision had official sanction from both military authorities and tribal leadership, a rare convergence of approval from usually opposing power structures. The following weeks brought their winter's transformation into tangible reality. With Captain Langley's preliminary claim registration providing legal foundation, Margaret selected a homestead location that balanced practical considerations with symbolic significance. A gentle rise overlooking Baldwin Creek, positioned almost exactly halfway between established trade routes and traditional Lakota seasonal camping grounds. Standing Bear and Akacheta, assisted by several young men from Black Eagle's band, helped construct a sturdy central cabin of traditional frontier, designed but incorporating elements of Lakota. Practical wisdom, specialized ventilation systems that prevented smoke accumulation while minimizing heat loss, strategic positioning that utilized natural landscape features for weather protection, and interior storage arrangements that maximized preservation of gathered resources regardless of season. Adjacent to the main cabin, they established a separate structure specifically designed as a schoolhouse, larger than typical frontier educational buildings, with flexible interior arrangements that could accommodate both conventional classroom activities and the circular teaching patterns preferred in Lakota. Knowledge transmission. Margaret's vision extended beyond physical structures to establishing practical systems for sustainable living that incorporated lessons from both cultural traditions. Kitchen gardens followed conventional settler planting patterns, but included native plants Elizabeth had learned to cultivate under Wichapi's guidance. Food storage combined frontier preservation techniques with Lakota methods for maintaining nutritional value through winter months. By early May, as spring firmly established itself across the prairie landscape, their homestead had taken recognizable form. Captain Langley fulfilled his promise, returning with official homestead registration documents that established legal recognition of what locals had begun calling Mitchell Crossing, acknowledgement that their location physically and symbolically bridged divided communities. More meaningful than official paperwork was the gradual integration of their vision into surrounding communities' daily reality. Several settler families, initially curious about rumors of a widow teaching Indian ways, discovered practical value in Margaret's educational approach. Their children returned home with knowledge of edible native plants that supplemented limited garden harvests and weather prediction techniques that improved agricultural planning. Similarly, Lakota families passing through traditional territories found Margaret's school offered useful instruction in English language and mathematical concepts increasingly necessary for navigating changing economic systems, while respecting rather than dismissing traditional knowledge. Young Clara proved particularly adept at creating educational games that helped children from both communities overcome initial language barriers through shared play. Standing Bear and Whichapi established their own permanent lodge nearby, rather than rejoining Black Eagle's band for summer migration, formally linking their family's future with the Mitchell homestead. Akecheta, now 17 and increasingly accomplished as cultural intermediary, assumed primary responsibility for security arrangements while continuing educational exchange with Elizabeth that had evolved into mutual teaching partnership. 1. Warm evening in late May, as fireflies began their summer dance across the prairie grasses surrounding their homestead, Margaret sat with Standing Bear on the cabin's covered porch. Their families mingled in the yard before them, Sarah and Whichapi harvesting early medicinal plants while explaining their properties to interested neighbor children, Rebecca and Clara playing a modified version of a Lakota game with visiting tribal children, Akecheta and Elizabeth deep in conversation about hunting strategies while mending equipment together. When a winter storm found your family struggling against death, Standing Bear observed quietly, who could have foreseen this new growth from frozen ground? Margaret smiled, watching 5-year-old Abigail solemnly instructing a mixture of settler and Lakota children in proper technique for identifying edible shoots. Knowledge that blended lessons from both cultures with childish enthusiasm that recognized no boundaries. Perhaps that's always the way of unexpected journeys, she replied. When established paths disappear under snow, new ones emerge that no one planned, but lead exactly where they're needed. Standing Bear nodded, his expression reflecting rare contentment. Two rivers meeting create stronger current together than either flowing alone. The metaphor captured perfectly what they had built together. Not erasure of distinct cultural currents, but deliberate confluence that created something more powerful through connection rather than separation. Their winter of survival necessity had transformed into a spring of purposeful bridge building, establishing a model for coexistence that challenged fundamental assumptions about identity and belonging on America's contested frontier. As darkness settled across the prairie and lamplight illuminated their shared homestead, Margaret recognized that their extraordinary journey had never truly been about mere physical survival. The harsh winter that should have claimed her family had instead revealed new possibilities for living with purpose that honored both her own heritage and the profound wisdom she had discovered in a culture previously unknown to her. They had created something precious at the intersection of worlds, a small haven where knowledge flowed freely across boundaries others considered impermeable, where children learned to value both book learning and practical wisdom, where cooperation replaced conflict as default interaction between communities typically defined by mutual suspicion. Mitchell Crossing would never fully belong to either world from which its founders had come. Instead, it would stand as testament to the possibility of creating new paths through uncharted territory, paths that followed neither traditional, native ways nor conventional settler expectations, but forged a unique direction aligned with changing frontier realities. The winter that should have ended Margaret Mitchell's family story had instead transformed it into something unprecedented, a narrative of survival that expanded beyond physical continuation to embrace cultural regeneration through connection rather than isolation. Their experience offered no simple template for resolving the broader conflicts engulfing America's Western territories, but it demonstrated that even in history's most divided moments, individuals of courage and vision could create small sanctuaries, where different waters might mingle without losing their essential character. As Margaret Mitchell gathered her daughters for evening routine in their new home, she reflected that their greatest achievement had not been surviving winter's deadly embrace, but rather creating spring's new possibility, proving that boundaries existed primarily in minds unwilling to imagine alternatives, and that the most enduring settlements might be those that bridged divides rather than fortified them. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.